The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over the small town of Fairhaven, where the streets were still damp from the previous night's rain. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and fresh grass, a reminder that spring was in full bloom. At the edge of town, near the old police station, a group of officers gathered in the training yard. The sound of their boots crunching on the cracked concrete echoed through the quiet morning. Among them stood Detective Daniel Rourke, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor. His sharp eyes scanned the yard, taking in the scene before him. In the center of the yard, a small German shepherd puppy lay curled up near a chain-link fence. His fur was a mix of tan and black, and his front paw was wrapped in a bandage. The puppy's name was Bob, and he had just failed another evaluation. Rick Coleman, the head trainer, shook his head in disappointment. "This one's out," Coleman declared, his voice firm. "The injury will hold him back. He won't make it through field work." The other officers nodded in agreement, their expressions indifferent. For them, this was just another day, another dog that didn't meet the program's standards. But Daniel couldn't look away. There was something about Bob that caught his attention. The puppy's dark, cautious eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness, but also a flicker of hope. Daniel slowly walked over to the fence and crouched down beside the puppy. Bob shifted slightly, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, tentatively, the puppy leaned forward and pressed his cold nose into Daniel's outstretched hand. A wave of emotion washed over the detective. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of children left behind by broken families, and in his own reflection on darker days. "I'm taking him," Daniel said, his voice steady as he turned to face Coleman. The trainer chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Rourke. This dog's a dead weight. He's going to drag you down, mark my words." Daniel didn't respond. He simply scooped Bob up into his arms, feeling the puppy tremble slightly before relaxing against his chest. The rain began to fall harder, dripping down Daniel's face as he walked away from the yard. To the others, it might have seemed like an impulsive decision, but Daniel knew it was the right one. Bob wasn't going to be thrown away like some worthless burden. Not if Daniel could help it. As Daniel drove home, Bob sat nervously in the passenger seat, his small ears perking up at every sound. The detective reached over and gave the puppy a reassuring pat on the head. "You're all right now," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. When they arrived at the house, Daniel carried Bob inside and set him down on a folded blanket near the couch. The puppy sniffed around cautiously, his steps hesitant as he explored his new surroundings. Daniel watched him closely, a sense of familiarity washing over him. Bob's guarded behavior reminded him of the witnesses he had spoken to over the years. People who had been hurt, who were afraid to trust again. The sudden ring of Daniel's phone broke the silence. He frowned as he picked it up, recognizing the number. It was Lisa Morgan, his partner. She rarely called after hours unless it was serious. "Rourke," he answered, bracing himself for bad news. "Daniel, it's about the Keller case." Lisa's voice came through, tense and urgent. Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Keller case had haunted him for years. A young girl gone without a trace, no leads, no answers. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. "A witness came forward," Lisa explained. "They say they saw something the night she disappeared." Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. After 5 years of silence, it was hard to believe a new lead could suddenly appear. But he couldn't ignore it. "I'll be there," he replied. As he ended the call, Daniel glanced at Bob, who had curled up near the couch, his eyes half closed but still watching the detective with quiet attentiveness. We've both got things we can't let go of, Daniel whispered softly. Outside, the rain began to pick up again, tapping gently on the windows. Daniel knew that tomorrow would bring more than just new information. It would drag him back into the past, a past he had tried so hard to escape. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of soft whimpers. He opened his eyes to find Bob standing by the side of the bed, his tail wagging tentatively. The puppy's bandaged paw was still tender, but he seemed eager to explore his new home. Daniel reached down and scratched behind Bob's ears, feeling a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Let's get you fed." In the kitchen, Daniel poured kibble into a bowl and set it on the floor. Bob hesitated for a moment, sniffing the air cautiously before approaching the food. As the puppy ate, Daniel leaned against the counter, sipping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind was already racing with thoughts of the Keller case. The witness who had come forward. What could they have seen? And why now, after all these years? He glanced at Bob, who was now sitting by his feet, looking up at him with those dark, soulful eyes. "You're going to have to stay here today," Daniel said, crouching down to rub the puppy's head. "I've got work to do." Bob tilted his head, as if understanding, and let out a soft whine. Daniel sighed, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew the puppy was still adjusting, and leaving him alone for the day wasn't ideal. But he didn't have much of a choice. He grabbed his jacket and keys, clipping a leash onto Bob's collar. "Come on," he said, leading the puppy outside. "Let's take a quick walk before I go." The morning air was crisp and damp, the fog still clinging to the trees as they walked down the quiet street. Bob trotted beside Daniel, his nose twitching as he took in the new scents. The detective couldn't help but notice how the puppy's presence seemed to ground him, even as his mind churned with thoughts of the case. When they returned to the house, Daniel knelt down and gave Bob one last pat. "Be good," he said, before heading out the door. At the precinct, Lisa was already waiting for him. She leaned against one of the concrete pillars near the entrance, her arms crossed and a grim look on her face. "You're here early," she greeted as Daniel approached. "Didn't sleep much," he replied, his voice low and rough from exhaustion. "Tell me about this witness." Lisa glanced around to make sure no one else was within earshot before continuing. "A guy came forward late last night. He claims he saw someone arguing near the Keller property the night Emily went missing." Her tone was clipped, as if she wasn't fully convinced. "Said he was too scared to talk before, didn't want trouble." Daniel frowned, processing the information. "And now he's had a change of heart?" he asked skeptically. He knew how fear could paralyze people into silence, but he also knew how unreliable guilt-ridden stories could be. "Apparently, yeah," Lisa said with a shrug. "Chief thinks it's worth pursuing. I guess the guy couldn't take it anymore." Daniel nodded, his mind racing, driven by guilt, often exaggerated or misremembered details. Still, after years with no leads, even the smallest thread was better than nothing. They had to act fast before the man's courage evaporated. "Where is he now?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Interrogation room 2, Lisa replied. "You want to handle it alone?" Daniel shook his head. "No, you're coming with me. Let's hear what he has to say." As they walked inside, the station buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Officers discussing cases, phones ringing incessantly. But for Daniel, the noise faded to a dull hum in the background. His focus was singular. This case had slipped through his fingers once before, and he wouldn't let it happen again. Outside, Bob remained alert in the car, his watchful eyes following Daniel through the glass. Somehow, Daniel found comfort in the thought that the dog was there, both of them confronting a past neither had asked for. The hallway leading to the interrogation rooms was quiet, dimly lit under flickering fluorescent lights. Daniel walked beside Lisa, his mind heavy with doubts. Witnesses who came forward after years of silence were often unreliable. Fear distorted memory, and guilt could create half-truths. Still, it was their first real lead in a case that had haunted him for years, and they couldn't afford to ignore it. He knew better than to expect closure, but maybe, just maybe, this man had something useful to offer. Lisa pushed the door to Interrogation Room 2 open, and Daniel stepped inside. The room was sterile and cold, with bare walls and a single metal table in the center. Sitting at the table was a man in his late 50s. His gray hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously between Daniel and Lisa. His hands fidgeted with a worn baseball cap, twisting the fabric in a restless rhythm. Daniel sat across from him, keeping his expression neutral and his tone steady. "Mr. Jacobs," he said, "you came to us last night with information about the Keller case. We appreciate you stepping forward, but I need you to walk us through everything you remember from that night." Jacobs hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table as he swallowed hard. "I wasn't going to say anything," he muttered after a long pause. "Not back then, not now, but I can't keep it to myself. It's been tearing me apart." He took a shaky breath. "That night, I was walking near Keller's property. I'd been visiting my brother and didn't want to use the main road. I was cutting through the back trail when I heard voices." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What kind of voices?" "Arguing," Jacobs replied, his voice tense. "Couldn't make out the words, but one of them sounded like a girl. Young." His hands tightened on the cap. "I didn't want to get involved, so I just kept my head down. But as I walked away, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. They followed for a few seconds, then stopped." Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "Did you see anyone? A face? A car? Anything?" Jacobs shook his head, his expression filled with regret. "No, I didn't look. I was scared. And when Emily went missing the next day, I knew I should have said something, but I didn't. I told myself it wouldn't have made a difference. Now, I can't stop thinking about it. What if I could have helped?" Silence hung in the room as Daniel processed the story. It wasn't much, but the fear in Jacob's voice felt real. The timeline matched, and even vague details were better than nothing. Still, Daniel knew they'd have to tread carefully. People driven by guilt often overcompensate in their statements. "We'll take your full statement," Daniel finally said. "If anything else comes to mind, you call us. Understood?" Jacobs nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. As Lisa and Daniel left the room, she glanced sideways at him. "Think he's holding anything back?" she asked. "Could be," Daniel replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "But his fear feels genuine. We need to check the area near Keller's property again." As they walked through the station, Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing his car parked near the entrance. Inside, Bob sat alert, his eyes following Daniel through the glass. Something about the dog's presence felt grounding, a quiet reminder that both of them carried scars from the past. Now, it was time to face them head-on. Daniel and Lisa drove out to the old Keller property in near silence. The road leading there was long and desolate, lined by skeletal trees that loomed in the misty morning light. Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind racing with the details Jacobs had provided. A vague memory of voices and footsteps wasn't much to go on, but they couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest lead. "Still think Jacobs is full of it?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, but he's definitely hiding something. Either he didn't see as much as he says, or he's afraid to tell us the rest. We've seen it before. Fear clouds judgment, especially when guilt takes over. Lisa hummed in agreement, her eyes scanning the empty fields passing by. You know, if he's telling the truth, whoever was there that night might have been watching him too. Makes you wonder if someone wanted him to stay quiet. The words lingered uncomfortably in the air. Daniel had thought the same, but hadn't said it out loud. Fear didn't just come from within, it was often enforced. Whoever had been near the Keller property that night might still be close. They could have been watching Jacobs all these years. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened at the thought. Finally, they arrived at the overgrown path leading to the back trails near the Keller land. The area hadn't changed much since the last time Daniel had been there. Weeds and tangled branches stretched across the dirt trail, but the skeletal remains of the old wooden fence that bordered the property were still visible. He parked the car, and the two stepped out into the crisp morning air. Bob barked softly from the back seat, his ears perked. "You staying or coming?" Daniel muttered to the dog, opening the door. Bob leapt out eagerly, sniffing the air with sharp curiosity. The dog's presence put Daniel strangely at ease. He gestured for Lisa to follow him as they started down the trail. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa admitted, kicking a stone off the path. "I can't believe it's been 5 years already. Feels like yesterday we were out here, searching for any sign of her." Daniel nodded silently. He remembered every detail of those searches. Combing through the woods in cold rain, the hopeless faces of the Keller family when nothing was found. The same frustration bubbled under the surface now, but this time there was a chance to do better. Bob walked a few feet ahead, sniffing at the ground. Suddenly, he stopped and growled low in his throat. Daniel froze, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "What is it?" Lisa asked, her voice sharp. Daniel approached slowly, watching as Bob stood rigid near a section of broken fence. The dog's nose twitched furiously, his body tense. Daniel knelt beside him and inspected the ground. There were faint impressions in the dirt. Recent footprints, partially hidden by leaves and mud. "Footprints," Daniel murmured. "Someone's been here." Lisa crouched next to him, her face darkening. "Those don't look more than a day old. Whoever it was might have come back to check the area." Daniel stood, his jaw clenched. The trail was growing warmer than he expected. If Jacobs wasn't the only one haunted by that night, then time was running out to find whoever had been here. He gave Bob a brief pat on the head, his mind sharpening with resolve. "Let's keep going," he said quietly. "We might not be alone out here." They moved carefully along the overgrown trail, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The early fog still clung to the trees, wrapping the area in a heavy stillness. Bob sniffed ahead of them, his nose close to the earth as he followed a scent that had caught his attention. Daniel kept his eyes on the path, occasionally glancing at the footprints they had found earlier. Whoever had been here recently might still be close by. Lisa adjusted her jacket, her voice low but tense. Those prints looked fresh. If someone's coming back here after all this time, there's a reason. You think it's connected to the witness? Daniel nodded. Could be. Jacobs said he felt like someone was following him that night. Maybe whoever it was has been keeping tabs on the area ever since. He glanced ahead at the trees. Some people can't leave the past behind, especially if they're trying to hide something. Bob suddenly stopped and let out a soft growl, his ears flattening slightly. Daniel immediately tensed and placed his hand on his holster. The dog sniffed the air, turning toward a dense cluster of trees to their left. Daniel and Lisa exchanged a glance before stepping off the main trail. The underbrush was thick, branches snapping under their boots as they moved through it. Bob led the way, his movements more cautious now. After several tense moments, they reached a clearing. Scattered on the ground were beer cans, a crumpled tarp, and cigarette butts, signs that someone had been camping here recently. Lisa crouched near the tarp, inspecting the area. "Looks like someone's been squatting out here," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe they've been watching this place for a while." Daniel crouched next to her, his gaze hardening as he scanned the campsite. "Or maybe they're hiding from something," he muttered. He picked up one of the cigarette butts and noticed how dry it was despite the recent rain. This wasn't left here long ago. They were probably here last night. Lisa stood and crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing in thought. If that's true, we might have scared them off when Jacobs came forward. Whoever it is, they know the area better than we do. Bob sniffed around the perimeter of the clearing, circling back to Daniel. The dog whimpered quietly, then nudged Daniel's leg. It was as if he sensed something deeper in the air, something unseen but lingering. Daniel gave him a reassuring pat and stood. "We need to process this site," he said, his voice firm. "Get forensics out here. If they've been camping here, they've left something behind." Lisa nodded, pulling out her phone to call it in. As she spoke with dispatch, Daniel took a final look around the clearing. The weight of the past 5 years pressed heavily on him again. This trail had gone cold for so long, but now it was as if the case was breathing new life into itself. Someone had been here, watching, waiting, and they had missed it. He wouldn't miss it again. Bob wagged his tail slightly, standing close to Daniel's side. The presence of the dog grounded him, reminding him that they both understood what it meant to carry old scars. With a deep breath, Daniel turned back to Lisa. "We're not leaving until we find out who's been out here," he said, his voice steady with determination. The fog around the trees seemed to thin, but Daniel knew the real shadows were still lurking somewhere deeper in the woods. The forest around them seemed to tighten as Daniel and Lisa continued along the trail. The fog had lifted, but the trees pressed close, their bare branches stretching overhead like brittle claws. Bob led the way, nose low to the ground, sniffing with intensity. Daniel followed in silence, his eyes scanning for any further signs of movement. He knew they were getting closer to something, or someone, but whoever it was had left only faint traces. "You think this is the end of the trail?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they moved deeper into the woods. "No," Daniel replied. "We stayed near the main trails back then. There was no reason to come this far out." He paused and pointed to a break in the underbrush. "But someone's been here recently. The trail's too fresh." Bob suddenly stopped near a tree, his body going rigid. He let out a soft but tense growl, ears flattening slightly. Daniel's gaze followed the dog's line of sight and caught a glimpse of a small opening between the trees. It looked unnatural. Branches bent aside and disturbed earth at its base. Lisa stepped forward, narrowing her eyes. "Looks like someone cut through here," she said. Daniel nodded in agreement and cautiously approached the opening. The air felt colder, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Beyond the break in the trees was a shallow clearing, littered with old debris. A crumpled tarp, empty cans, and a stack of branches arranged in an odd, makeshift barrier. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show someone had been camping here. "Squatter camp," Lisa murmured, crouching near the tarp. "Probably used it as a lookout point. Think it's related to the prince?" "Maybe," Daniel said, carefully stepping over to inspect the site. He ran a hand over one of the cans. It was dry, despite the recent rain. Whoever was here hasn't been gone long. He stood and glanced toward Bob, who was circling the edge of the camp with quiet intensity. The dog seemed agitated, his posture stiff. Daniel's instincts sharpened. He had seen this behavior before. Bob wasn't just curious. He was sensing something nearby. Daniel crouched beside him, running a hand along his back. "What is it, buddy? What are you picking up?" The dog didn't respond but kept his focus on the tree line. Lisa joined them, her expression tightening as she noticed the same unease. "Think they're watching us?" she asked quietly. "It's possible," Daniel muttered. "They might have seen us with Jacobs and decided to bail. If they're out here, they'll be desperate not to get caught." Bob growled softly again, and Daniel stood. He scanned the woods carefully, catching a flicker of movement in the distance. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill down his spine. Someone was out there. He could feel it. "We need to call this in," Lisa said, already pulling out her phone. "Agreed," Daniel replied, his voice low. "But we don't leave the area until forensics gets here. If they're nearby, I want eyes on every inch of this place." Lisa nodded and made the call, while Daniel continued to scan the clearing. The forest was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Yet, he knew the stillness was deceptive. Someone had lived out here, hidden in plain sight for years, and now they were on the run. Bob stood alert beside Daniel, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Daniel's jaw clenched as he considered their next move. Whoever had been in these woods wouldn't be able to hide much longer, not with the trail growing warmer by the minute. As they waited for backup, Daniel's mind raced. The Keller case had haunted him for years, and now it felt like they were on the brink of uncovering the truth. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Whoever was out there had gone to great lengths to stay hidden, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. Daniel glanced down at Bob, who was still tense but calm beside him. The dog's presence was a reminder that they were in this together. Both of them had scars from the past, and both of them were determined to face whatever came next. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the silence. Backup had arrived. Daniel felt a surge of relief, but knew the real challenge was just beginning. They had to move quickly, before whoever was out there could disappear again. "Let's go," Daniel said, his voice firm. "We're not letting them get away this time." The forest seemed to hold its breath as Daniel, Lisa, and the backup team moved cautiously through the trees. Bob stayed close to Daniel's side, his ears twitching at every sound. The dog's instincts had proven invaluable, and Daniel trusted him completely. The trail of broken branches and disturbed earth led them deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light dimmed. The air was heavy with tension, and every step felt like a step closer to the truth. Finally, they reached a small clearing, hidden by a dense cluster of trees. In the center of the clearing stood an old, rotting shed, its door hanging on rusted hinges. The structure was barely visible under the overgrowth, but it was clear that someone had been using it. Daniel exchanged a glance with Lisa, his hand resting on his holster. "This wasn't here during the original search," he muttered. "They've been hiding in plain sight." Bob let out a low growl, his body tense as he stared at the shed. Daniel crouched beside him, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "Good boy," he whispered. "You've done great." He stood and motioned for the team to surround the shed. "We go in carefully," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're dealing with." The team moved in unison, their training evident in their precise movements. Daniel and Lisa approached the shed from the front, while the others covered the sides. The door creaked as Daniel pushed it open, revealing a dim interior. Inside, they found signs of a makeshift camp: a torn sleeping bag, empty food cans, and a small pile of personal belongings. But what caught Daniel's attention was a map pinned to the wall, with trails and locations marked around the Keller property. "They've been tracking the area," Lisa said, her voice tense. "This isn't just a hiding spot. They've been planning something." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still one missing: the person behind all of this. As they searched the shed, Bob suddenly barked sharply, his attention focused on a cluster of rocks near the edge of the clearing. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and saw a flicker of movement. "Over there!" he called out, drawing his weapon. The team moved quickly, surrounding the area. From behind the rocks, a figure emerged, a man, gaunt and pale, his face partially obscured by a hood. He stumbled forward, his hands raised in surrender. "Please," the man rasped, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this. It wasn't supposed to happen." Daniel stepped forward, his weapon lowered but ready. "Who are you?" he demanded. "And what are you doing out here?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Daniel and the others. Finally, he spoke, his voice shaking. I was here the night the girl disappeared. I've been hiding ever since." Daniel's heart raced. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What did you see the night Emily Keller disappeared?" The man took a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I was camping out here," he began. "I wasn't supposed to be on the property, but I didn't think anyone cared. That night I heard voices near the trail. A girl was arguing with a man. I couldn't see them clearly, but it got heated. Then I heard her scream." He swallowed hard, his face pale with fear. "I didn't want to be seen. I stayed hidden. But I heard him dragging something, her, I think. I ran. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe. But after a few days, I started hearing things. Footsteps, whispers, like someone knew I was out here and didn't want me talking." Lisa exchanged a glance with Daniel. "You think someone's been stalking you all these years?" she asked. The man nodded violently. "Yes, they leave traps, watch from the trees. I've moved camp dozens of times, but they always find me." He gestured toward the trail behind him. "They're still out there waiting." Daniel's instincts flared. It wasn't just fear driving this man, it was survival. Someone had been protecting the secret of Emily's disappearance, going to extreme lengths to keep witnesses silent. He knew they didn't have much time. Whoever was watching would realize soon enough that their hiding spot was compromised. "We need to get you out of here," Daniel said firmly. He turned to Lisa. "Call for backup again. We're not alone out here." Lisa nodded and spoke into her radio, relaying their position and requesting immediate assistance. The man glanced nervously between the trees. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They don't want you here. They'll come after all of us." "Let them try," Daniel replied coldly. "We're done running." The tension thickened as the forest remained eerily silent. Daniel kept Bob close as they began escorting the man toward the clearing. Every sound, every crunch of leaves and rustling branch felt amplified, as if the woods themselves were watching. Bob stopped occasionally, his ears twitching, before moving forward again. They finally reached the spot where forensics had begun setting up a perimeter. Officers emerged from the trees, armed and alert. The man sagged in relief at the sight of them, but Daniel remained on edge. He knew whoever had been out here wouldn't give up easily. Lisa approached, walking beside him. "Think they'll come after us now?" she asked. "They've been hiding for years. The second Jacobs talked, they panicked." "Desperate people make mistakes," Daniel said. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Bob barked once, breaking the quiet. Daniel looked down at the dog, then back toward the woods, somewhere beyond the trees. The person responsible for Emily's disappearance was still out there. But for the first time in years, the truth was within reach. Daniel wasn't going to stop until he found it. What do you think will happen next? Do you believe Daniel and Bob will finally uncover the truth about Emily's disappearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring tales of courage and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Together, we can spread hope and kindness, one story at a time.